IVM.
In India, we ignore our coastlines when we think about international relations. But if you, like me, grew up by the sea, then you know that water has its own history. Take the Bay of Bengal, for example. Think about Burma bazaars in Tamil Nadu, Hindu shrines in Cambodia, Chinese communities in Kolkata, Arab traders in Sri Lanka, plantation workers in Southeast Asia. These are webs of relations, stories of commerce, of community and cosmopolitanism. Welcome to the first episode of States of Anarchy. I'm your host, Hamsini Hariharan. Today's show is not about a single state. We're going to be talking about the Bay of Bengal as a region. And my guest for today is the best person to comment on it. Sunil Amrith is the chair of the Department of South Asian Studies at Harvard University. His new book, Unruly Waters, is about how Asia's history has been shaped by water. We're going to be talking about Sunil's first book, Crossing the Bay of Bengal, The Furies of Nature and the Fortunes of Migrants. The book won him a MacArthur Fellowship, which is also nicknamed the Genius Grant. And when I read it, I understood why. The book is almost lyrical, and that's not something I would generally describe academic research as. I was lucky enough to catch Sunil Amrith on the sidelines of the Times Lit Fest, and we recorded this conversation then. We'll be back after a short break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following us on social media, please make sure that you are. We are IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you are following us on social media, I'm sure you know that it's our 4th anniversary this month. Yeah, IVM is 4 years old. We've done 3,500 plus episodes of content, and it's been an amazing ride with a lot of fun guests, a lot of fun content, and a lot of great hosts. We'd like to thank all of our hosts because without them, we wouldn't really be doing all that much. Also, I'd mentioned over the last couple of weeks that we're running a survey right now, a listener survey. It's on ivmpodcast.com/survey. If you have not filled that out, please do fill it up. It'll help us figure out what is working for you, what's not working, and will give us some information that we can use to get some advertising on the show. On the Scene and the Unseen, Amit Verma is joined by author Srinath Raghavan. They discuss the recent tensions between India and Pakistan, its historical context, and what the future may hold. We're launching a new show called States of Anarchy about global affairs, hosted by foreign policy enthusiast Hamsini Hariharan. On How to Citizen, we move on to Chapter 8, Confronting Marginalization. Meghnad and Shreyas are joined by creative director Joel Pereira, who draws from his professional and personal experiences to discuss the topic. On Advertising is Dead, Varun talks to executive editor of Rolling Stone, Nirmika Singh, about new age journalism, what it takes to be a music journalist in India, the rise of Indian hip-hop, and a lot more. Also check out last week's episode with Gaurav Kapoor, founder of Oak Tree Sports and former VJ, who talks about his journey to becoming a sports presenter and what's missing in our sports content. On Golgappa, Tripti is in conversation with musician Karan Chitra Deshmukh. He talks about how he got into playing instruments and gives a glimpse of his talent on the show. On Geek Fruit, Tejas and Jishnu talk about their favorite classic TV shows and give their opinions on which can be potentially revived. Also check out last week's bulletin, where they talk about IVM's 4th anniversary and their favorite shows on our network. And with that, let's continue with your show.
Hi, Sunil. Welcome to the show. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
No, I'm very excited about this podcast because, I'll tell you how I ended up reading your book. I was actually asked to take a break in 2017 to have 6 weeks of bed rest because it was just a really bad time for my neck. Okay. So at that point in time, I couldn't do anything and I was just looking for books to read. And then I found your book, I think, on a catalog. So I ordered it. And what was weird was that I used to live in Bangalore, but I was back in Chennai just for those times. And I was reading the book because my house is right next to the sea. And I just felt very prophetic that I was reading this book about the Bay of Bengal while sitting across the Bay of Bengal. So tell me how you started writing this particular book. You've done some work in migration before, right?
That's right. I had done some work on migration, and I didn't set out to write a history of the Bay of Bengal. I set out with a much more limited aim, and that was to write the history of Tamil labor migration to Malaya. That project then, it took on a life of its own as I became interested in exploring all of the ramifications of that movement, moving beyond Malaya to think about Burma as well, and even Sri Lanka to some extent. And moving beyond just looking at labor migration to thinking about the movement of culture and the port cities, which ended up playing quite a prominent role in that book. And eventually, I think it was a friend who suggested, well, aren't you writing a history of the Bay of Bengal? And I said, well, yes, that's exactly what I'm doing.
That's good. Okay, I'm just going to read a quote from the book, which you have obviously heard tons of times before. But quote, "Picture the Bay of Bengal as an expanse of tropical water, still and blue in the calm of January winter, or raging and turbid with silt at the peak of summer rains. Picture it in 2 dimensions on a map, overlaid with a web of shipping channels and telegraph cables and inscribed with lines of distance. Now imagine the sea as a mental map, as a family tree of cousins, uncles, sisters, sons, connected by letters and journeys and stories. Think of it as a sea of debt bound by advances and loans and obligations. Picture the Bay of Bengal even where it's absent, deep in the Malaysian jungle where the Hindu shrines sprout from landscape as if washed by the sea, left behind. There are many ways of envisaging the Bay of Bengal as a place with history. One is rich and complex as the history of any national territory." End quote. What was running through your mind as you were writing this? I'm curious.
If I remember correctly, I think I wrote that quite late in the process of writing the book. In fact, I think I'd more or less written the book and realized that it needed a little bit more framing. So I went back to the beginning and sort of added a few more layers. The prologue, for example, I wrote at the very end. I don't remember exactly whether that quotation's from the prologue or from the first chapter, but it was one of those things where I went back over it, trying to sort of think of the big picture and the big story that I wanted to tell. And that particular passage, I think, was one of the places in the book where I tried to convey a sense of all of the layers of this history, the fact that this is about nature, this is about migration, but it's also about ideas and the imagination.
And how did you go about researching for the book? Because your footnotes seem to be very, very extensively researched, and you've gone through journals and diaries and newspapers and official records. So how did that process go?
That took a long time. And I have to say the research for that book was a particular pleasure. I mean, I think even compared to other projects that I've done before and since, there is a special place in my heart for the research process for Crossing the Bay of Bengal, partly because I did a lot of oral histories. I spent a lot of time in Malaysia, for example, in areas that either still are or until recently were plantations, talking to older people, collecting their stories. I did archival work in Tamil Nadu at the National Archives in Delhi, but also in Myanmar, in Malaysia, and Singapore. So that led me to sort of investigate all sorts of different parts of the archive. And then, yes, print culture became an important part of the story. And there are wonderful collections of Tamil language newspapers published from Singapore, Penang, Kuala Lumpur. You find these at the British Library, you find these in the National Library of Singapore. So trying to really enter into the mental world of that time as much as possible really helped me, I think, to sort of convey the richness of the story.
And how did you deal with the barriers of language? Because these were in Chinese, in different dialects of Mandarin, I imagine, Tamil, a bunch of different Indian languages.
So I read Tamil, so the Tamil language sources were accessible to me. I read enough Malay to be able to use primary sources. And then the rest, I'm very lucky that there are lots of translations, and those translations are themselves an interesting part of the story, to the extent that you have Tamil newspapers, for example, syndicating pieces from the Chinese press in the 20s and 30s. The British colonial government was, of course, itself, for its own self-interested reasons, obsessed with translating things. So you have official translations of Chinese newspaper articles, which I think one has to take with a grain of salt. But nevertheless, there are ways of getting some sense of that richness. I wish I read Burmese. That is an absence in those chapters on Burma, as the local perspective on all of this. But there too, first of all, English was a lingua franca throughout the region, and, middle-class Asians were very often writing in English. So that too sort of helped me to transcend some of my own limitations in terms of language.
And so newspapers are sort of the turning point in the book. It's when you have the modern nation state sort of taking precedence over what used to be an interconnected web of relations. Via a framework, how do you see approaching the Bay of Bengal as a region just by itself?
So I think there is that narrative that an interconnected imperial world, and I mean, I think this is the irony of that situation, is that the interconnectedness was enabled by a brutal system of exploitation. I mean, I think that is the irony. And at the same time, the closing down of those connections was very often, at least initially, in pursuit of an ideal of freedom, an ideal of self-determination and self-reliance. And so I think, yes, there is a sort of rise and fall narrative in that story, that this is about an interconnected world that comes to be much more divided. But I'm also interested in exploring all the paradoxes of that, including the losses and the gains that came with that.
All right. We'll be back after a short break.
Advertising is dead. Yep, you heard me right. Advertising is dead. We're all in the content business now. Let's not call it news, TV, radio, etc., etc. It's all content, and we're in the middle of this weirdly exciting phase where all the borders and lines that have been drawn over decades has been swept away by this lovely thing called the internet. We're a show where we don't dwell on just the stuff that is now, but rather the wider stuff about advertising, media, content, and the whole goddamn circus surrounding it. Tune in every Tuesday for our weekly unboxing of the mystery box we used to call advertising. I'm Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch, and this is my new podcast, Advertising is Dead.
Welcome back after the break. You're listening to States of Anarchy, and I'm Hamsini Hariharan. When I think about the relations between South and Southeast Asia, generally people go back to thinking about the British colonies and not before that. So could you tell me a little more just in terms of the book, where you've started with the history of the Bay of Bengal as a region?
I mean, the book took me much further back in time than I, as a historian, was sort of trained to deal with. I'm very much a modern historian. All of my work has been on the 19th and 20th century, and that is the core of Crossing the Bay of Bengal. But I realized I couldn't tell the story without going much further back. So there are parts of the first couple of chapters that really do go back, before European colonialism, to think based on what evidence we have, and of course based on the reading of scholarship by archaeologists and by ancient historians, of what those connections might have looked like a long time ago. And for me, one of the big questions, and maybe it is a question that remained to some extent open and unresolved in the book, is what is the relationship between that much earlier set of cultural and migratory connections between India and Southeast Asia and the modern connections which were under British colonialism? Is there something of a sort of bedrock or foundation that had already been laid in terms of the connectedness of these places that actually allowed for that period of mass migration and mobility in the 19th century? I think I'd continue to have an open mind about the answer to those questions. I think it's possible to argue that what the British did was just completely different, that this is about modern capitalism, this is about plantation agriculture and exploitation. But then there are, I think, especially in the history of the port cities, I think you can actually see that certain communities provide a continuity. Tamil Muslims, for example, who were never sent as plantation labor, their history is one of these threads of continuity. I mean, from the 13th to 14th century, they have established themselves in the ports of Southeast Asia, in what is now Kedah, all the way across the Indonesian archipelago. And they continue right through the colonial period to move as traders and shopkeepers and money changers. And I think looking at that particular community, you can see that maybe there isn't such a fundamental difference in the modern history, that there are at least certain communities for whom, the Chettiars, I think, provide another example of that.
Yeah.
That there are these links that predate mass migration and colonialism.
So these are also then stories of communities themselves. And just like how, we can dispute if there is something such as a warring community, these still continue to be labeled as communities that do well with commerce, that do well with trade. Something else that I was also thinking about is in India, particularly when it comes to foreign policy towards Southeast Asia, the first thing that politicians do is stress on, like historical ties, whereas there is a sort of rejection of that from Southeast Asia, if the way I perceive it, at least, because you would want to relinquish the Indianization of your identity to gain your own identity. So how do you think of it when it's such a it's such a web of relations that you can't separate one from the other?
I think you've put it beautifully. I think searching for origins and authenticity in this part of the world is a futile and also often politically dangerous exercise. I mean, I think the point to emphasize is really that it's so hard to identify an authentic Indian or Southeast Asian culture when so much of this was shaped in interaction. And I think the problem with that Indianization narrative is really that it suggests that this history is best seen as one of the export of Indian culture. And I think that Southeast Asian scholars, Southeast Asians, would see it much more as the sort of local incorporation of a set of influences, amongst which, of course, influences from India, from South Asia were important. But I think that the tendency to go back to that greater India idea in a lot of contemporary discussions is not likely to resonate very well in Southeast Asia.
No, I completely agree with your point, because it just takes a particular narrative and tries to sort of manipulate it for political capital or whatever it might be. Something else that I was thinking about is that when you speak of history, there's also this narrative of, the Cholas were a seafaring nation, they went out and they conquered parts of Southeast Asia. And as a historian, I want your opinion on, did the Cholas actually conquer Southeast Asia? If they did, why did they withdraw suddenly? How do you look at that episode?
So, I mean, I think the first thing to say is we have to remember how limited our base of evidence is. And there's a huge amount of uncertainty still, even among specialists, among archaeologists, among those who are expert in reading the inscriptions that we have as our main source base to understand that. There's a lot of uncertainty about what drove those naval expeditions, whether they can be considered conquest as such. I mean, I think the term most commonly used to describe them is naval expeditions. I mean, this was a forward movement, not necessarily a movement of colonization. I don't think one can call it that because it was short-lived. I mean, I think the broader story of both that expansion and subsequent withdrawal has to do with the bigger picture of the fact that the Cholas had deep trading connections with China, that the Chinese Empire at that time expected tribute from a number of other regional powers, including the Srivijaya Empire, which was the subject of the Chola raid. There's some suggestion that, in fact, this might essentially have been about commercial competition between the Cholas and Srivijaya in connection with that coastal trade with China. So, first of all, I'd really acknowledge the huge gaps in our knowledge, which might never be filled, which is why there was a recent novel, I wish I could remember what it was called, that actually tries to imagine that period.
Empire?
That's the one, yeah.
Devi Ashura, yes.
Yeah. And, maybe we have to turn to fiction and to other media to really at least try to imagine that moment, that era.
Okay. That's interesting because at the Pragati podcast, we actually hosted her and we spoke to her about a bunch of things and the research that she was doing. What I liked particularly while reading your book and while reading about maritime history, the Bay of Bengal in general, is that there is a very cosmopolitan, globalized vibe to it. You can't help but talk about places like Kedah or Nagapatnam or just small cities now without talking about how they were teeming with life and different languages were spoken on the streets. Is that just a sort of nostalgia for the past on our behalf?
I think you've put your finger on what, for me, is the biggest discomfort that I have and had when writing that book, which is, I think that kind of nostalgia is a risk of any sort of maritime history. I think that's a strain that we find in almost all work on the Indian Ocean. And I think there is a strain of that in my book that I was not able to sort of eliminate. And I think we need to be very careful with that. I think the historical evidence does show that these smaller ports really were teeming with life, that they were extremely diverse in terms of the languages that one heard, in terms of the origins of the people that were there. I do think there is a sense that places which are now small towns, it can be difficult to imagine them as gateways to this wider world, but they were that. I think where the nostalgia comes in is to sort of minimize what was deeply undesirable about that world. The fact that it was an imperial world, the fact that labor was exploited in a way that is horrific when you're reading those primary sources of what it's like on the plantations of Malaya in the 1870s and 80s. And I think one needs to think about that diversity always, I think, in context of the political and economic forces that made it possible, which I think we certainly don't want to cultivate any nostalgia for.
Fair enough. Something that I was also wondering was how easy or difficult was it to separate the Bay of Bengal as a region by itself, because it's also deeply interconnected with the Arabian Sea at some point, and within the Indian Ocean as well. I don't think you've touched on, how the Indian Ocean also interacts with Africa, because then you also have to move into what's happening from the Middle East. So how did that happen for you?
That was one set of boundaries to draw. Of course, the other is the boundary to the east, that the Bay of Bengal and the South China Sea are very deeply interconnected. And to some extent, that's the Malay Peninsula marks something of a frontier, but it's a very, very fluid, porous frontier. So in fact, one could tell this story expanding either west or east in some sense, that the Bay of Bengal is both part of the wider Indian Ocean world, but it's also part of what I suppose now is thought of as the Indo-Pacific world. That concept didn't exist at the time, but very much that sort of continuity with the South China Sea. I think my view was very much that there's nothing inherent or coherent about the Bay of Bengal as a region. It is just a space of particularly intensive connections, all of which are then sort of rooted in broader geographies, not just maritime ones, but of course in interior ones as well. I mean, I think that was one of the things that struck me, that we need to think about the Bay of Bengal in connection with the river systems, in connection with the interior of both India and parts of Southeast Asia. So I think that it's only a starting point, and I think you can follow those connections in whichever direction either your questions or your imagination take you.
All right. Okay, this is my last question. But for someone who wants to know more about migration, about the Bay of Bengal, what would you suggest as reading?
I would start with fiction, really. For me, as a historian, I've learned an enormous amount, particularly from Amitav Ghosh's fiction. And in terms of the Bay of Bengal, I think The Glass Palace is the novel that really stands out for me, because that is a novel of the Bay of Bengal. And I think for anyone who wishes to sort of get a sense, an intangible sense, but a powerful one of what this region was, the work of Amitav Ghosh and others like that might provide a way in, provide a starting point. I mean, there's all sorts of specialist literature by historians on different aspects of Bay of Bengal and Indian Ocean history, but often, and even as a teacher in my classes, I often do start with pieces of fiction if I'm trying to think about the Indian Ocean world.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for joining me.
It's been great.
If you've stuck with us till the end of the show, thank you. I agree with Sunil. Reading fiction is the best way into getting interested in anything. Also, see if you can catch his books. It will change your world. That brings us to the end of this episode of States of Anarchy. If you have any comments or questions, you can reach out to me on Twitter, where I'm @HamsiniH, or on Instagram @States of Anarchy. You can listen to States of Anarchy on the IVM podcast app, website, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'll be back next Tuesday.
Hello, everybody. We have a brand new daily podcast we're working on with Bloomberg Quint. All you need to know provides the top news on business, markets, and the economy so that you can stay ahead of the curve. Tune in every morning on BloombergQuint.com, the IVM Podcast app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday.
On the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!